Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with another week of World War III analysis. We are on the brink as we anticipate this Iranian strike, the response, of course, to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran that occurred just hours after we released our last episode of World War Now. So, of course, as we're here recording, I anticipate that Iran will strike, so we can't bring you the news properly, but that's just how things go. We have a lot to talk about regardless, but we're going to be predicting what this strike could look like. We're going to be predicting Israel's response as well as the broader international community, how they are going to react to the U.S. Could this be what brings the U.S. into war with the whole Iranian axis of resistance? Will Hezbollah have a strike at the same time? Will the whole axis strike at the same time as Iran? Will there be a Golan front? We're going to be talking about all of these questions, as well as how Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, how all of the Muslim Arab world is going to get involved and respond to all of this. Of course, we're going to be talking about the huge Ukrainian incursions into Kursk, F-16s over Ukraine at this point. So I'm not sure what the goal is, extending themselves this far into Russia, but we're going to be breaking all of that down. Of course, we're going to be talking about the race war in the UK after this Rwandan stabbing and now all of these anti-Muslim protests and then the Muslim responses. We're going to be talking about Tommy Robinson and how all of this ties into the potential Zionist narrative towards war with Iran that would gaslight the entire Western world against this sort of latent Islamic terror threat. There's even news that there was an Iranian or a Pakistani that was funded by Iran that wanted to assassinate Trump. So we're going to be tying all of these things together, talking about the Bangladesh protests, talking about the situation in Venezuela, which ties into the huge global economic downturn that everybody is now talking about as stock markets around the world have basically collapsed and are way down. Crypto is down. All sorts of economic metrics are down. People are thinking this could be the big market bubble pop that has been awaiting the West, since the COVID, stimulus and the unlimited printing of monies at the very least, if not for even longer than that. So it is a major World War Now week, to say the least. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing good, Conrad. And, before we get into the really thick, important news surrounding the Middle East, I think it's important to discuss some of the drama taking place in Russia at the moment, where essentially a new front has really opened up. And it's been quite a few months now since the Russian incursion, the pushback from Belgorod towards the Kharkovskaya Oblast. And we did discuss the northwestern oblast, just, northwest of Kharkov, which is, of course, the Sumskaya Oblast, the deep forest there, which are very hard and impassable. But it seems like Ukraine has finally made an incursion into Russian territory from that Sumskaya Oblast as they left and penetrated past the Russian border right into Kursk. And the Kurskaya Oblast, that name may be familiar to a lot of you who recall World War II history, the Great Battle of Kursk, probably the largest battle in human history. Thousands of tanks either side, the Third Reich and the USSR at one point battled out here in this particular oblast at the Battle of Kursk in the 1940s. But here we have further battles in these same particular areas, which is pretty crazy. So the Ukrainians took at least 10 to 20 troop carriers, armored troop carriers, as well as some mobile artillery units into the Kursk Oblast along some of the highways. They took a lot of Russian conscripts actually hostage as they broke through the really lightly defended Russian border security, Conrad, which really surprised me slightly because, again, this attack, it didn't take place as per Ukrainian tradition and as per the tradition of many militaries around the world. Typically early in the morning when the troops are still getting up, people really haven't had their coffees, there haven't been the morning reports at the different command centers. This attack essentially took place in broad daylight during the day in the afternoon, and suddenly the Ukrainians pierced Russian defenses and went several kilometers deep, capturing quite a few villages in the Kurskaya Oblast. And this was a huge surprise. Putin is meeting actually with his Security Council of the Russian Federation right now. Shoigu has returned from Iran on a sudden trip back to Moscow, and this is being discussed at the moment in the Russian Federation as to how to respond to this Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. Now, mind you, it has been pushed back, so the good news for the Russian Federation is that the Ukrainians did lose at least 10 armored vehicles in this particular incursion, this battle, which took place over the last 24 hours prior to this recording. So this is really hot news right off the table for you guys. And what's interesting is, yes, there's been between 30 and 50 conscripts, and these are young Russian conscripts who are just doing their basic training. They're doing their 1-year conscription work, essentially just defending the border in a territory which frankly hasn't seen any action during the entire SMO. So these 18, 20-year-old Russian troops, several of them were taken hostages, and this is probably an analogous and important event because you do need to consider that there was a recent hostage exchange crisis, and suddenly Ukraine has filled up its POW bank by an additional 20, 30, perhaps even up to 42 new hostages, which is very demoralizing, I think, for for the Russian Federation, and because these boys are really young and they're frankly not professional soldiers. But Conrad, it was very interesting to see all the various villages that Ukraine still holds actually in the Kursk Oblast, as the troop carriers released all of their Ukrainian elite sort of soldiers, allegedly elite soldiers. We're not sure exactly what kind of infantry brigades they did release, but the villages of Abukhovka, Pokrovsky, Tolsty Lug, Lyubimovka, Darina, Nikolaeva Darina, and Sverdilovka have all been captured and are still being held by Ukraine to this day. And yes, some Russian media channels are reporting that Ukrainians have been completely pushed out of Kursk, but it doesn't appear so at this moment. Now, there was a large town, roughly 5 to 6,000 people. These villages I just listed off, they're, roughly they have maybe a population between 30 and 50 people each. So they're not very large. It's a literal village in the real sense of the word. But the town of Sudzha, actually, with 5,000, 6,000 people, was also attacked. The Ukrainians tried to enter into the town. They were repelled by the local militia as well as the local National Guard, who, frankly, there was a Chechen Akhmat battalion there. And of course, the Chechens took complete pride in announcing that they have defended the town from the Ukrainians. What's interesting is there was a monastery actually positioned on the outskirts of the town. As the Ukrainians were entering, they turned their artillery towards the monastery, which wasn't aligned or adjacent to any military targets, and began bombarding it. And the local villagers, the people, actually hid everybody inside the church, which then was hit by what appears to be a HIMARS shell. Frankly, based on the damage to the roof of the monastery, the St. Nicholas Cathedral, which is the chief church in this small monastery complex. And of course, the desecration of churches is, of course, a Ukrainian and a Jewish signature. So as we can see, we're not really surprised, but this is quite harmful. There was a video released by the priest of that monastery, the leading priest monk, and he said that no one was hurt, but a lot of people were very scared, demoralized, and frankly, the Ukrainians were pushed back of Sudzha. But all these various towns, Conrad, in Kursk, they are still under Ukrainian occupation. And the footage was absolutely insane that came out over the last 24 hours. We saw what appears to be Russian Sukhoi fighter jets flying around, taking out some of these Ukrainian troop carriers who essentially are just driving along these flat open roads. Again, of course, the Russian Tornado S, which is like the Russian version of the HIMARS. This is a mobile, if you can imagine, a mobile 8-wheel truck carrying a missile launcher on the back, and it essentially can move pretty quickly. These Russian Tornado S launchers took out a lot of these armed carriers as well. As soon as they stopped to release troops, these Tornado S launchers locked in and they took out the Ukrainian targets. So the Russians are doing quite well in retaliating, but again, a strike this deep into Russian territory, it's probably the first slight Ukrainian victory we've seen in months, frankly, because Ukraine has been getting pushed back on almost every front in the SMO zone. So really surprising and shocking news, frankly.
Yes, I'm not exactly sure what the Ukrainian goal is in the midst of all of this. Of course, we know that Ukraine has been more willing to negotiate. They seem to want to come to the negotiating table. Perhaps they're willing to go back to Istanbul or Astana and sit down with the Russians, but the Russians have said that they aren't currently interested in that. And now it seems that the Ukrainians are intent on showing that they will use the full extent of their military might to go right into Russia proper, not fight in the current SMO zone, just create a whole new front. That, again, Russia, of course, had been pushing into Sumy and Kharkov oblasts before, but it seems that all this is going to do is harden the resolve to expand the SMO, to expand the territorial expansion, to expand the annexations and the eventual, adding of these other oblasts to the Russian constitution in Kharkov, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, these other places that border these Russian regions, if the Ukrainian military is going to insist on using Western weapons to directly assault Russia proper. And then, of course, we know that the first F-16s have been seen flying over Ukraine. We've seen them over Lvov and over other parts of Western Ukraine. Perhaps they're trying to create a big enough buffer into this part of Russia where they could perhaps fly some F-16s, get some propaganda shots, and maybe do a few symbolic strikes with their new Western weapons, their new planes, in Russia proper over the SMO zone or something. But all this seems to me is that it's going to make Russia more likely to expand the SMO into a whole host of other territories and not want to negotiate, which frankly is fine with me. Obviously, it's terrible to see people die, for churches to be bombed this way, for, new conscripts to be taken hostage, and all this kind of stuff. But if this is what it takes for Russia to get rattled and realize that just because they are not as powerful as the West doesn't mean they can just resign themselves to a, this sort of stalemate peace situation. They need to assert the situation on the ground. If it's going to be their territory, if it's going to be their sphere of influence, then they're going to need to own it properly, right? But speaking of, F-16s and planes and sonic booms, as we await this Iranian strike, which, again, we don't know when it's going to come. Obviously, we didn't know that the assassination of Hania was going to happen either, which is why we didn't discuss it last episode. If we knew that was going to happen, I would have waited 4 hours and just recorded it later. But of course, we know that Ismail Hania, the political head of Hamas, the true leader of Hamas. There, of course, are the leaders of the Al-Qassam brigades and the others that are still fighting in Gaza, but he was the head of Hamas, the elected leader of the political movement that led the Gaza Strip, still technically does, but up until the Israeli occupation that is currently ongoing, he was killed at an IRGC safe house in Tehran. He was there for the funeral and for some kind of celebration of Ibrahim Raisi, as well as coordination with, obviously, Iran for the general fight against Israel, but there's disputed rumors about whether or not it was a bomb placed in the IRGC house by perhaps an embedded Mossad agent, or if it was a missile that actually struck the house itself. The Iranians seem to claim it was a missile, with Israeli authorities leaning more towards the embedded bomb, which kind of an interesting. I would have suspected each side would claim the opposite, because a missile being able to strike Tehran like that doesn't seem like a good look for Iran. But regardless, this was a huge escalation. This comes after all sorts of Hezbollah leaders had also been assassinated. Of course, Fuad Shakur, who is basically kind of the second in command of the military wing, the actual on-the-ground fighting of Hezbollah, who had actually been commanding the Hezbollah operations against Israel since October 7th. He was taken out in a strike on Beirut, which apparently was supposed to have targeted Nasrallah, but Israeli intelligence was unable to physically locate him, so they took out Fuad Shakur instead. And at this point, there's also been all sorts of other divisional and mid-level generals and lieutenants taken out amidst all of these airstrikes by Israel. So the amount of resistance leaders that have been killed is insanely high, and with Hania, the true leader of the Gaza resistance, now dead, the response from Iran and the Axis is going to have to be extremely strong, and Iran has said that they aren't broadcasting this attack at all. So unlike the previous symbolic strike on Israel back in April, where nobody died, not even much damage was incurred, it was basically just Iran showing, yes, if we want to, we can overwhelm the Iron Dome. We aren't getting any of that broadcasting. So the rumor is that it's going to actually do material damage, sufficient damage to potential Israeli military targets, and it also could be basically a joint attack between Iran and Axis of Resistance forces, with some of the most bold predictions anticipating obviously a joint Hezbollah and Iranian military barrage, as well as a potential Golan front with Iraqi and Syrian resistance forces actually physically entering the Golan Heights, which of course is internationally recognized as Syrian but occupied by Israel. And this of course ties into the recent speech from Nasrallah, who of course initially gave a response after the death of Haniyeh and has now given his second speech basically talking about the response from Hezbollah, who they kind of hinted that it could be a joint response with Iran, but also that they could respond on their own. And Press TV has sort of provided a lot of translations of the speech, and one of the things they say, which makes us a little bit frustrated, is that the waiting is part of the punishment. That's what they're saying, right? Because we're all just ready to get this on and cover what actually occurs, so we can start to break down the front that's going to unfold from these strikes in the West and how everybody's going to react. And again, everybody's talking about World War III, so it's a real World War now week. But Nasrallah is basically saying how Israel doesn't tell the truth about the Majd al-Sham strikes. He claims that it was a misfired interceptor missile, not a Hezbollah strike. He talks about that it's clear that Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war, talking about the American involvement, all of the kind of standard stuff, but he does talk about how there will be a decisive strike from the general total axis of resistance, which we are all awaiting. But he's obviously taking his cues from Iran. We wonder how aggressive Iran really wants to be. We know that Israel does want this escalation, so the question of how Iran is going to handle this is really up in the air, because on the one hand, yes, we know Israel wants to get really bloodied so they can punch back harder with the full might of the United States Navy. We see the USS Theodore Roosevelt in the Strait of Hormuz, all sorts of other planes being scrambled towards the Persian Gulf. We see them taking off from Qatar to Kuwait, going all over the region. So we know that Iran is very much surrounded by the U.S. axis, as much as they've created the axis of resistance. But there was a big strike on the Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq by Kataib Hezbollah, which is another, of course, Iranian-funded militia in Iraq. The rumor is that 2 U.S. servicemen died. I haven't seen that confirmed by the U.S., but at least, I believe, 6 or 7 were confirmed injured, or severely injured, by U.S. sources like Reuters. So all of this is heating up very dramatically. The Houthis have shot down another M9 Reaper. That's a whole other part of the axis of resistance. So the region has never been more tense. We have never been closer to a full-on Middle Eastern regional war. And in the context of Ukraine, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Venezuela, all these other things we're going to talk about, it really is going to be the indisputable start of World War III, I believe. Not just, as we say, the the annexations of Czechoslovakia. That's sort of the era we're in right now with Ukraine, the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Myanmar, Sudan, Sahel, all these things. But once this thing we're talking about here really goes down and the missile strikes become daily and constant across a continent, then everyone's going to realize, oh wow, it really is World War now.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely crazy, and the possibility of black swans is very high. I'll just mention two, which I think have been, on the mind of a lot of people. Frankly, well, you mentioned, of course, Conrad, one of the chains of Hezbollah attacking some of the American bases in Iraq. And of course, with the help of, these Iranian proxies striking American bases, which are still positioned in East Syria in Iraq for some reason, literally decades removed now from the invasion of Iraq and what took place during the Bush presidency, but still American troops are still endangered in these particular positions. It's really a crime against the American people. But the real black swan is not even those US bases, but in fact, if you really consider the event kind of spilling over, it's those particular carrier strike groups positioned at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean. You have at least 2 US ships in the Red Sea at the moment. So essentially free waterfronts where US sailors, US Navy employees, and various other military men are positioned. And essentially they're just awaiting an unknown call from either Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or even Netanyahu himself, or maybe even Anthony Blinken, some other Jewish handler inside the White House, to enforce a certain defensive position over the region, right? And begin firing at a particular designated target, whether it be Hezbollah, the Houthis, as happened, a few weeks ago, or potentially even Iran, which, again, you're right, Conrad, the Netanyahu provocation really hasn't kicked off. It appears that Hezbollah and both Iran, Ali Khamenei, are really taking their time. And the new president of Iran, him being more of a dove, at least on paper, I think assists in not overreacting, because it seems like Israel very much dependent on Iran overreacting and potentially striking unannounced in an uncoordinated fashion, potentially dealing a severe blow to civilian casualties in Israel, which would further galvanize the situation and again force the US naval groups to engage some of these Axis of resistance forces, which are already positioned there. So as soon as those naval groups are engaged, I think that's a potential black swan event that will take place, especially if any one of those ships end up sinking. And as you mentioned, the Reaper drone being taken out by the Houthis over Yemen, this is already the 7th Reaper drone. Mind you, they do cost $30 million American dollars per drone. So 7 times 30 million, you can imagine it's a lot of money. You can build an entire hospital complex for that amount. But no, these Reaper drones are flying, essentially killing farmers over Yemen, or even spying on farmers and people wearing sandals and running around with AK-47. So it's complete imbalance of power and a misuse of authority, which is taking place in some of these areas. And again, it's really unjustifiable. There's no accountability here. And it's really crazy because at the same time, Conrad, you do have large shipments of weaponry. We saw a huge Ilyushin planes flying over the Caspian from Russia into Iran. We all thought in preparation for this particular strike, which still hasn't taken place. So potentially Russia is carrying some sort of defensive missiles, potentially other weaponry to Iran, maybe even hypersonic missile launchers of some sort, in order to power up Iran for this attack upon Israel, or even those American ships positioned in the Persian Gulf or just at the entrance. Who knows exactly what these Ilyushin planes were carrying over the Caspian. Shoigu himself did arrive in Iran. He stayed approximately between 5 and 6 hours. He met with the top Iranian leadership. Mind you, Shoigu is not the Minister of Defense at the moment. He is simply the security advisor of the Russian Federation councils. But nevertheless, he does have that 10 plus years of the Minister of Defense experience. So in the eyes of Kim Jong-un, Ali Khamenei, and the other leadership of Iran, and all these other sanctioned international countries who are enemies of the USA, Shoigu does appear like as a figure of authority. At the same time, Shoigu in the past, say 2017, he has met up with Netanyahu. Him potentially having Jewish blood as well does give him some authority even in that Israeli Jewish world. So perhaps I was speculating that potentially Shoigu was also acting as a dove, maybe speaking to some of the Iranian generals and leaders, kind of talking them down, saying, hey, look, so we know the leader of Hamas was assassinated inside of your capital, but you don't need to really overreact. This wasn't personal. It was just an Israeli strike against one of their sort of nemesis targets. And mind you, Israel even admits to further attempting to assassinate more of its enemies, just as actually it was announced right over X. And X, there is a terms of service on X, and Elon Musk did state you shouldn't really threaten anyone. But the Israeli financial minister Bezalel Smotrich actually tweeted on X. He said Israel must not respond to Nasrallah's speech. Israel must assassinate him. A very interesting sort of attempt on Nasrallah's life, who Israel has tried to take out multiple times before. But it's quite clear. And in fact, that death of President Raisi, flying back from Baku, Azerbaijan, wherein Shoigu actually stopped as well on his way back to Russia, Conrad, which is quite interesting because it's almost as if Shoigu's multitasking here. He was sent on a special mission by Putin to Tehran, to Baku, and back to Moscow to discuss this new Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians. It seems like Russia is moving and acting in a lot of these various theaters as well, trying to keep the peace. Playing the peacekeeper here. Notice China's not very involved at the moment. It's only making these large bellicose statements from abroad, and the entire region, as you said, it's very, very tense. There's a lot of black swan opportunities. We've mentioned earlier, just a few weeks ago, Russia has over 20 miniature bases around the west coast of Syria, and of course the Tartus port, which Russia stages, the Admiral Kuznetsov, the only Russian aircraft carrier, which is quite modern and really well built, does stop at the Tartus port on occasion. And this is all in Syria. And naturally, Israel has been flying sorties over Syria, bombing the Damascus airport and various other places for almost a decade now, and somehow missing any of these Russian bases and Russian servicemen. And all you can imagine is if Hezbollah escalates, if of course the conflict over the Golan Heights, Conrad, which you mentioned, escalates, and there are missiles, drones flying from Iran into Israel, and Israel sends out these S-35 stealth fighters or these F-16s, and they end up bombing one of the Russian bases, which results in the deaths of Russian servicemen, not Wagner troops, not mercenaries, not random employees or immigrants, but actual Russian servicemen. That is when Russia will become involved. And this is when, of course, Turkey, NATO comes into the picture. The Russian Black Sea Fleet does it head south in order to push back the US and sort of secure the Russian force in Syria, that expedition which Strelkov was talking about for almost 8-9 years now as a potential loose end of Russia, because that expedition in Syria is very isolated. It is surrounded by NATO, surrounded by countries who are hostile to Russia ideologically as well as geopolitically. It's a very, very tense situation. Lots of opportunities for provocations, which of course Mossad is very skilled at, which is what they've done by assassinating the peacekeeper of Hamas, you can say. Like Ismail Haniyeh, he's had at least 40 family members killed by Israel, the IDF and the Zionists, including a granddaughter. He himself has been quite, I would say, he's been known for actually coming to terms and actually negotiating and potentially working towards a peaceful agreement over Gaza and some of these other places. But now those peace agreements have been shattered. And this new leader of Hamas, at least the interim leader, Yahya Sinwar, as you know, Conrad, he is from the military wing of Hamas. So Yahya Sinwar will, in fact, probably not take the same peace-oriented stance. And in fact, Hamas and its 30 to 40,000 fighters who still remain on the ground and working around Israel and Palestine, they're going to keep pushing the IDF, and there will be probably no surrender from this particular group of Islamic militants. So Israel's in a tough spot. We have Bezalel Smotrich literally tweeting death threats, and Netanyahu, the rhetoric will continue. He's just stating openly that Iran is the enemy and the US needs to stand behind its greatest ally in the Middle East. It's looking very, very tense, and naturally there doesn't seem to be a resolution, at least on paper. So we do have to kind of depend on countries like Russia, who literally doesn't even have a presence in the Middle East besides its very small expedition in Syria, in order to somehow mend both these sides. It's simply, I don't even think it's possible at this point. And you know what makes it even worse, Conrad, right, is the fact that Israel broke some of its accords with Russia when Israel promised at the beginning of the SMO not to trade and not to give any weapons or technology to Ukraine. But in fact, we've seen Zelensky's videos where he's walking around the Ukrainian airports checking out the new F-16 fighters. And on the F-16 fighters, you can see Israeli-made infrared missile warning system tech literally attached to the F-16 planes. So Israel has been providing the Ukrainian anti-Russian forces, and these planes, these F-16s, you bet they will be shooting civilian targets, as unfortunately the Ukrainian Air Force has done and the drone forces have done for literally a couple of months now at least, like intensely targeting civilian targets. We've seen drones flying into apartments in Russia. It's been crazy. So drone warfare is about to start very heavy, and in the Middle East, as well as it will probably continue in Ukraine. So it's looking like a very dense situation, like a Gordian knot, which is about to be untangled, Conrad, but perhaps not even untangled, but there'll be an explosion and all the knots will flay around and it'll be quite a messy situation. So just wondering your thoughts, and maybe even about that Azerbaijan-Armenia circumstance, what potentially Shoigu spoke to Aliyev about in Baku, or maybe it was just to stop and kind of, discussing potentially economic ties or something of that sort, maybe something light. Although, mind you, I just want to say one thing about the death of President Raisi on the 19th of May. I think at this point, after the death of Ismail Haniyeh, his assassination, my opinion is that most likely President Raisi, that wasn't a helicopter crash. He was probably taken out in the same fashion as the head of Hamas. And Iran simply clenched its teeth and did not admit it. At least this is my theory. Now that we can see essentially how arrogant and how confident for some reason the Israeli special forces are for taking out some of these key Iranian and axis of resistance allies. So it's getting very fiery in the Middle East.
No, I completely agree. And I think you mentioned Raisi. The question is, was it an Israeli strike? Was it an Azerbaijani collaboration with the Israelis? Some have speculated that Pezeshkian himself, the new president, compromised Ismail Hania's security within the IRGC. Of course, we've talked about him as a Azeri Turk, Kurd, both of which are much more aligned with the US and Israel in the region compared to pretty much any other group aligned with Iran. Also, of course, you mentioned the new head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who is obviously in Gaza fighting. He is not, being a politician in Qatar, traveling to Iran, traveling to Syria like Hania was. But now we have someone on the ground in Gaza witnessing everything that's going on. I think the potential for these hostage exchanges and negotiations is pretty much out the window at this point. So that is a very important piece of the puzzle as we await these Iranian strikes, because they also realize, well, if the cat's already out of the bag on this Gaza issue and it's just us versus them as far as what comes out of it, then the strike might be a lot more dramatic. And I've speculated, I've said this on Twitter and elsewhere, that I think it would be a smart move if they somehow could assassinate Smotrich and Ben Gvir, right? Because sure, taking out Netanyahu's a bit of an escalation. That would maybe be more like taking out the Ayatollah himself or Assad. But if you take out Smotrich and Ben Gvir, you send a strong message against militant genocidal Zionism and Judaism, as well as you basically destroy Netanyahu's coalition and feed him to the wolves of his own liberal opposition. So I think it'd be a pretty fantastic move. I, of course, would support it. I think those guys, they deserve it to the very least. Let's put it that way. But I think going back to Gaza, the fact of the matter is the Israelis are not doing as well as they thought they would in Gaza. There's rumors that they've only fully defeated 3 Gaza battalions and have lost thousands and thousands of troops, hundreds of Merkava tanks, and of course the fact that they've had to relocate so many of these soldiers to the north to prepare for the Hezbollah front and to the West Bank to fight against the ongoing insurgencies there as they also brace for Jewish annexation. The fact of the matter is that their idea of fully destroying Hamas is never going to be achieved, which is part of why they felt the need to assassinate Hania, because that can send the message to their supporters that no, we really are taking out all of Hamas. And you mentioned that all of Hania's family, of course, had been killed in the past. At this point, the fact that he was killed by them, he probably wasn't really that afraid or worried, but the fact of the matter that he lost all of his children, his parents, his wife, I mean, he probably had multiple wives, I don't know, but the fact that he lost literally everybody, it's the same thing with Nasrallah. Pretty much everybody that Nasrallah started out in with Hezbollah and all these other people are dead. He has a few other people that have been with him since the beginning, but he's accepted that he's also going to die fighting against Israel. So in many ways, everybody is ready for what, they refer to as martyrdom. But you mentioned the situation with Shoigu in Baku, and now these Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiations. They have agreed to not move forward with the Zangezur corridor operation that we've talked about extensively that would have connected Turkey and all of Azerbaijan through Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan exclave, and then given them a small corridor through southern Armenia to fully legally connect with the Caspian Sea all the way to Baku, which would have been a huge geopolitical victory for Turkey. It would have literally separated all of the North Caucasus, from the rest of the Middle East with this Turkish belt, and it would have just been an insanely strategic advantage for Erdogan and the Neo-Ottoman Empire as we head into World War III. And we talked about how that could have been an essential development for them to potentially, checkmate Russia in a potential conflict with the Turks and the Russians in the region. But now that that is not moving forward, part of the prophecy about Russia's quick victory over Turkey, despite the fact that those circumstances seem silly right now, we know that it'll be an overnight shift. Now with this Zangezur corridor out the window, it seems that could be more politically plausible. So very interesting developments. But you mentioned, of course, the impending Iranian strikes, and then, of course, the Israeli response. If the Iranians do something as dramatic as assassinate major political figures, or do strikes that have civilian casualties, or perhaps begin an ongoing sustained offensive through their proxies, that could really lead to a likely strike on the Iranian nuclear capabilities by the Israelis. And I just want to read a prophecy from Elder Theodoros Agiopharagides from Crete. It's from 2016. He reposed recently. He says, "Guys, you will be drinking your coffee and you will hear that the Jews attacked the nuclear program of Persia. That's when events of greater magnitude will begin. And at the same time, or a little earlier, Erdogan will fall. These will be the signs of the big events to come, so you understand that they are near, at the door." So again, this is what we've been tracking with since the beginning of the show. We know that Erdogan in his own capacity is sort of holding back just by staying alive, this cascading escalation of World War III as we've said at the most basic level, Turkey will immediately shift more towards the West and stop being this realpolitik player looking out for its own interests, playing the multipolar world against NATO in the West. That will go away. The opposition will take over, and they will embrace a secular Kemalist, NATOist line that will be more aggressive towards Russia, that will probably be much kinder towards Israel, and definitely a lot less kind towards Iran. So all of this is very interesting. It's also very frightening. So be sure to keep everything in your prayers, because we are on the verge of World War III, and we know that ultimately this is coming because of the sins of the world, because of a lack of repentance, both within and without the Christian world. So as Christians, we know we are held accountable for our sins and our knowledge of the truth, more strongly than the non-believers will be. So we need to be, increasing in virtue and praying and making sure that we are, attending the services and doing everything we can in these times. But, Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about the impending escalations in the Middle East, we know that Cyprus is being asked by dozens of countries at this point to assist with the potential evacuation of their citizens from Lebanon, from Israel, from Palestine, even probably from parts of Syria, Jordan even. So Cyprus obviously is going to be right there. I'm going to be in Cyprus in a little less than 2 weeks. So hopefully I don't get, prevented from flying due to airspace closures. So pray for me that all works out. I should be meeting and interviewing Metropolitan Neophytos. So again, incredible opportunities abounding in the midst of these insane times. But Dimitri, unless you have any thoughts on the Caucasus stuff, on any of the other things going on in the Middle East, connecting that to other fronts, feel free. But we also, of course, have to talk about the situation in the UK as these riots continue. Apparently, there's going to be much more over the weekend as the, anti-Islamic, anti-migrant, conservative, nationalist British identitarians take to the streets in response to this Rwandan stabbing. I think it was 3 children or something like that. Horrible. But we have a lot to talk about, connecting that even to these Bangladeshi protests and other things. So what are you thinking?
Yeah, it's curious you mentioned Cyprus, because that's exactly where Mr. Tommy Robinson, the alleged, man who set the UK on fire, is at the moment residing. So he's having a holiday there in Cyprus. He's blamed the left wing media for actually doxing his location, etc. And he's he's in the sunny eastern Mediterranean. That's very curious, because we do know Cyprus, at least the Greek part of Cyprus, is home to some pretty extreme Zionist forces at the moment. And Cyprus could be one of those bases that the US, of course, is dependent on in the eastern Mediterranean. Who knows exactly what kind of a role that particular island will play. Like, it's played a very key role during the Crusades, and maybe once again it'll play like a key role. We do know about Saint Nicephorus Phocas, of course, his conquest of Cyprus, one of his greatest victories during the Byzantine Empire as well. Very key island, right? I think in terms of eschatology, in terms of world history. And here again, it is at the center of events, and it's just very cool. Tommy Robinson, naturally, this is a very known figure. He's very famous for his documentaries, his speeches in the UK and England against, in particular, Islamic immigration, specifically because he is pro-Israeli, pro-Jewish, pro-Hindu, pro-Sikh, pro-immigrant from anywhere else, pro-East Asian, what have it. He's not actually an anti-immigration spokesperson. He's specifically anti-Islamic, and perhaps, Conrad, as many analysts have already stated, and even Russian alternative media sources have begun pointing out, is the fact that Tommy Robinson, this main organizer, this UK journalist, has very close ties to both Mossad, the IDF, and even Israel, some of the power forces who may be holding his leash very tight, which is why he's never spoken out against Jewish power, which has held its reins over the UK over the last at least 200 years and has governed the United Kingdom and the British Empire before that according to its whims. And frankly, all the issues that the UK is suffering today, which potentially is causing these mass, you can even say partially organic, and I think from the ground roots, these people are frustrated with mass immigration. They're frustrated with random Rwandan kids, be it the kid was Christian, Muslim, it doesn't really matter. The fact that there are foreigners in England, in the UK, stabbing local people and going crazy, whether it be MK Ultra programming or just simply people losing their minds due to modern, the psychological pressures of modern society, it really doesn't matter. The mass immigration in the UK and England has set off a chain of what can really be said as anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic riots. And now the UK is definitely alight, and the new Prime Minister with his Jewish wife, Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of the UK, has made some very, very open-ended statements where he's said quite clearly that the UK police will be visiting the houses of these protesters. They will be identifying them. There will be CCTV footage taken. Anyone who's provoking this particular riot or these series of riots across the UK will be fined, and some people will be facing jail time as well. So the British legal system, as well as the police state of the UK, is charging itself up in order to crack down on these rioters. But what's curious, Conrad, is the fact that Tommy Robinson, you have essentially someone with a clear connection to Israel, provoking a lot of these attacks, potentially maybe even provoking the particular anti-Islamic flavor of this anti-immigration ground roots movement in the UK. This, you can say, almost organic uprising that the British people are experiencing at the moment. And it's also happening in Northern Ireland, which is very scary because, of course, we all remember the 1960s or all the way up to the 1990s. Northern Ireland was very intense. You have the IRA and like literal Western European terrorism taking place there. So that's a very intense area to also see rioting. I think everyone's really scared of what's happening in Northern Ireland and if this particular anti-immigrant position could spill over into there, right? Just from the mainland of Albion to its neighboring state. So that's quite scary. But all things considered, there's also this weird angle, Conrad, wherein you do have the UK very friendly with Qatar, which is, of course, the home base of Hamas, very friendly with the Muslim Brotherhood, which it allows. Hamas, officially, the organization is branded as a terrorist organization in the UK since, I believe, the early 2000s. So Hamas is banned, but the Muslim Brotherhood has found a massive home in the UK. And we know the Muslim Brotherhood's base is in Qatar, as well as Al Jazeera's home base is in Qatar. And Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh himself, he was from Qatar. So Qatar is a very interesting, curious place. There is this grand conspiracy in the background. I don't want to get too deep into it. This royalist conspiracy that the Muslim royals and the ancient royals of Central and Western Europe are all aligned, and even Putin has to sort of pay his dues to them, which is interesting because when Putin won the election this year and a bunch of presidents sent their congratulations, the first person Putin actually called after the election this year was actually the Emir of Qatar. Very interesting. Not the King of England, but the Emir of Qatar. And the Emir of Qatar is very good friends of King Charles. And this Qatari British relationship is very curious because Tommy Robinson, naturally being anti-Qatar with his pro-Israeli views, could have potentially provoked this anti-Islamic riot in the UK. Well, this is at least what the British media is telling us. So it's just a very interesting sort of situation. Again, very, very complex, but looking from the outside and analyzing it, kind of checking it as objectively as possible, what we can say is the people of Western Europe, they're growing in their nationalism. They're reacting to the globalist agenda of replacement, essentially replacement clergy plan theory, which is taking place for sure in Central and Western Europe in particular. We know in Russia they've been trying to do it as well, but the Central Asian immigration is simply not coming in as deeply and as intensely as it has been in Europe after World War II. And finally, the English people are waking up, the Irish, the Scottish are waking up, and they're reacting very intensely to it. Now, potentially, this fire and this internal frustration may be directed towards the particular target at which the globalists want to aim it. And in fact, this may end up in very severe crackdowns on freedom of speech, freedom to protest, freedom to actually come out into the public. And, it could end with who knows what kind of monitoring and microchipping the UK can get to. I mean, it is a very deep police control state, one of the homes of the Rothschilds, one of the homes of the modern fiat banking system. It is one of the home bases of the globalists, you can say. In the city of London, it's a very dark, scary place. And of course, even the king, his recent portrait, it's very, very clear that King Charles and the royal family are very much in on whatever is happening at the moment. It's not just the parliament that rules, and even the monarchists, unfortunately, in the UK, I think, understand that there's something going wrong from the top down. And unfortunately, Keir Starmer doesn't really, he's probably a crypto Jew himself, and he doesn't really give us any confidence in the future. So the British people are upset, and the hopes, Conrad, is that they force all of their energy in the correct direction and do not allow themselves to be swayed as World War III literally almost unfolds in the Middle East in order to assist and frustrate those situations further and more.
Well, unfortunately, it's very unlikely that the protesters will be able to overthrow the government of the United Kingdom. So obviously, I think committing violence and burning things down is not the way to go. Unfortunately, we see, obviously, people are calling Keir Starmer two-tier Keir. He is clearly, he's going to put these people in jail for 10, 20 years if they do certain things. Meanwhile, again, brown immigrants are allowed to just stab people and run around and collect welfare and not work and do all sorts of nonsense. Again, the Rotterdam, rape gangs got thousands of girls over the course of years, literally because the police were too afraid to investigate because they didn't want to be called racist. So, the Saxon, is beginning to hate as the occupation by Jewry that is allowing the Great replacement to occur in their cities and in their countrysides is obviously going to lead to some of these outbursts and some of these what unfortunately are going to get redirected into basically just honeypots for dissidents to get arrested and for perhaps sentiment that would lead to support of Israel's operations in the Middle East, because this is occurring at the exact same time as these huge riots and color revolution, basically of some capacity, is occurring in Bangladesh, where the Hindu prime minister, who's been in power since 2009, was driven out and forced to flee to India, and now leaders of her movement and party, the Anwari movement, who are Hindu in some capacity, are being burned alive, and Hindus are being attacked. It's again, we know that Muslim and Hindu relations, all from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all throughout the subcontinental region, are very tense. That's why Pakistan and Bangladesh exist. Those were supposed to be, the Muslim countries, and then India was ostensibly for a more Hindu population, but obviously nothing perfectly works like that, and now it seems that the Muslim population is rising up against the Hindus, and we know that in India there have been Hindu kind of pogroms, for lack of a better word, against Christians and Muslims as Modi's party has gained power and Hindu nationalism has risen. And this, of course, ties in with Myanmar, which is currently seeing the largest victories from the People's Defense Forces against the Tatmadaw. They took one of the largest cities that they've ever taken recently, 130,000 people. So very hot across all of this region. This is why it's World War III. People don't talk about Bangladesh, Myanmar. Of course, China is doing drills all around these Filipino shoals, which is, very much distracting the U.S. You talked about how China isn't doing too much in the Middle East, but I think their continued sort of escalations in the South China Sea regarding Taiwan and with these Filipino shoals and other things, even with Vietnam, is definitely keeping the U.S. spread thin, not allowing them to put perhaps their full naval might in the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea or other places where they may want to, because they realize they've got to keep their eyes on China, who could make a move on Taiwan at any moment as well. So total worldwide, this is not regional. Obviously, we're talking about the outbreak of the regional war in the Middle East, but the world war is real. And I think the fact that any of these sparks could go off, I mean, we're talking about China, Taiwan, this impending strikes could lead to, again, like we talked about with the Prophecies, a huge retaliation on Iran's nuclear capabilities. And you talk about the possibility of false flags. Nick Fuentes was on Alex Jones talking about this. Any of these U.S. aircraft carriers, any of these ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, any of those go down, we already see potential deaths in the Ain al-Assad airbase. Any kind of large-scale casualty of U.S. troops is going to immediately shift U.S. public opinion more towards a pro-war position, where we have to, like J.D. Vance, the potential future vice president, said, we got to punch back hard on Iran. So, that's what we have to look forward to, pretty much regardless of who wins the election. Of course, Kamala Harris picked Tim Walz as her vice president. There's really not much to talk about there. He's the progressive governor of Minnesota. He oversaw the BLM riots, so that kind of shows you what we're in for here. But all of this unfolding, it ultimately comes down to what is a large-scale Jewish conspiracy to prime the pump for the West to support a war with Iran. I think the Bangladeshi protests could even have something to do with that. Of course, the protests being co-opted by Tommy Robinson in the UK directly have to do with that. We believe that these riots are from a genuine sentiment, that it's legitimate. Obviously, we saw in Belfast that Republican Ireland, IRA, Ireland independent supporters were marching with loyalist, Hand of Ulster, Northern Ireland, people that want to stay united with the United Kingdom, they were marching together against immigration. So truly uniting the right, white people, Anglo-Saxons, Irish are coming together against, mass migration. But then this was co-opted by Tommy Robinson. The original attacker, this Rwandan, wasn't even Muslim. And the sentiment isn't just against Islam, it's against any kind of replacement migration, even from Christian parts of Africa, even from, in theory, South America. We see Brazilian immigrants doing crimes in Europe as well. All of this needs to stop. But somehow then we have Tommy Robinson coming in and leading protests at mosques and spreading fake news initially that the killer was a Muslim, and now suddenly we're talking about Gaza protests and pro-Palestine protests being places of violence, and we've totally lost the plot. It's not about replacement migration anymore. It's this anti-Islam crusade right as we're on the brink of war with Iran. And we know that the UK is like the number 2 player to the US as far as Western strikes and Western involvement in the region goes. You talk about Cyprus, the 2 huge bases in Akrotiri and Dioclea are British bases. So they're going to be critical in this region. They've been striking the Houthis just as much as the U.S. has. So it all really is connected. And one of the biggest connections that really ties it all together is this news about this supposed Iranian Pakistani assassin trying to kill Trump. The news is that the day before Matthew Crooks attempted to shoot Trump, there was this Pakistani who apparently just came from Iran 2 weeks ago, who came to the US and was attempting to pay someone $5,000 to attempt to kill political figures. One of those on the list was Trump. And then, despite all of that, the day later, the Secret Service, despite knowing about this, the Secret Service was directly involved in the arrest of this guy the day before the Trump rally. They let Trump take the stage. They let this Matthew Crooks guy stay on the roof for an hour. They knew he was using a rangefinder. The Secret Service snipers refused to hit him. They sent one cop up there who didn't even do anything. The whole thing is total nonsense. It's not just fishy, it's clearly evidence of some kind of conspiracy. And now what are they doing? They just released this news on August 6th. They're trying to blame it on Iran. They didn't release this news right when they arrested the guy because it would have looked very suspicious for, right after all of this happens. But then, now that everyone's simmered for a little bit, we're all awaiting this huge strike. They released this news, and now there's another casus belli for the U.S. to go to war with Iran. They tried to kill our previous president, or the current leader in the race. We gotta go after them. They're a regime. Lindsey Graham is introducing bills to go to war with Iran in the Senate and to directly strike them. So things are escalating very much out of control, and unfortunately, we would love to support this outpouring of identitarian energy in the UK, but Tommy Robinson live tweeting it from Cyprus. I mean, the energy is being absorbed and redirected towards this pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli cause that ultimately is going to lead to no deportations. There's going to be no overthrowing of the government, and everybody involved that's in it for the good reasons, the real British people on the ground, they're going to go to jail for years and years and years, and Tommy Robinson is going to hang out in Cyprus and he's going to be fine. So keep all of that in mind before you go to any of these potential protests this coming weekend. If you are in the UK, be sure to stay safe. But I talked about Myanmar. That's a big front as well that nobody ever talks about. But probably the next thing we have to hit is this potential worldwide economic collapse. Obviously, this isn't an economic show, but the past few days have seen huge worldwide downturns on pretty much every stock exchange. I know East Asia was hit the hardest. I think Taiwan saw like a 45% drop, like huge. Japan, Korea, they're all way down. Saw videos of, Japanese taxi and Uber drivers with all of their portfolio in the red, just shaking their heads. And of course, the NASDAQ and all these things were down like 1,000. So people are pretty much anticipating what could be one of the big bubble pops, pretty much the next big thing since 2008. And again, I don't know all the details on that. Crypto is way down, so people are talking about re-upping their crypto bags, among other things. So the economic aspect of World War III is finally starting to hit. And if we're in a huge stage of volatility where people are speculating about total potential economic collapses in the midst of huge strikes between countries and the Ukrainian front line collapsing, victory for Russia, all of these things, they may pop the bubble on purpose either right before the election or right after the election, depending on what they want to happen. If they want Kamala to win, they'll probably keep the train running. But if they really want Trump to get into office, they might pop this economic bubble. And I don't know, if they think that could lead to Trump winning, they definitely do it. But if they pop that bubble as World War III unfolds, things might fly off the handle, and there might not be an election. Things might revert to their military phase, if you know what I'm saying, where things are decided more with bullets and swords as opposed to parliamentary meetings and votes. So I think obviously that's what's being anticipated on the Eurasian continent, and that could easily spill over here into the U.S. And we know that Elder Ephraim Metropolitan Theophytos, specifically in his TASS interview, he talked about how geophysical phenomena in the U.S. will coincide with a lot of these events, like the Jews striking Iran's nuclear program and the stuff going on in Turkey and the eventual fall of Erdogan, that ultimately some of this stuff, like volcanoes in Yellowstone or potential fault lines in California and earthquakes, we might see these things start to occur in the United States, which sure, we might not be punished by missiles, but we might be punished by, a spiritual missile leading to an earthquake or a volcano, you could say. So we've got to keep it all in prayer, right? But you might have more insight on some of this economic stuff than me, Dimitri. Of course, we know that there's a huge war for resources and minerals going on all around the world. That's what partially Taiwan is about with microchips, and we know that Argentina in Malay, that was largely about securing lithium, for Elon Musk and his electric cars, as well as just the general U.S. market. But of course, Venezuela's in the spotlight, as well as their oil reserves and their claim on Essequibo and all of the offshore reserves there coming into play. So any thoughts you have on the current economic situation and the potential for total collapse? I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, there's some really interesting news actually. As you mentioned, Argentina, just briefly, there's some news coming out of the cabinet, and perhaps this is like whistleblowers within the Argentinian government. They're stating that Milei allegedly has allocated $4.5 billion worth of US dollars worth of gold to a Rothschild bank. So essentially moved all of the reserves of Argentina, whatever it had left, offshore, just in case the country could be experiencing perhaps an internal Maidan or revolution. This is probably has to do with whatever's taking place in Venezuela and some of the hot discussions happening in South America, but also as World War III progresses, crisis, and we spoke about massive famines, hardships around the world, a lot of these countries will be suffering domestically as well as international trade essentially gets put on hold while countries exchange not contracts and goods and services, but will be exchanging missiles and things like that. So as things get violent, a lot of these countries will need to be at least autarkic and self-dependent, which we know many of them cannot be due to the 20th century and just this co-dependence of liberalism and capitalism, which we're all kind of sitting on that needle at the moment, aren't we? Especially the second world and most definitely the third world. We see this, Turkey is trying to do its best by allegedly working with Somalia, securing some of those key resources off the coast of the Horn of Africa. So searching for new actual oil and gas deposits just off the coast of Somalia. So the Turkish Navy, it's actually the majority of it is not in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's actually off the coast of Africa, past the Red Sea. There's a very interesting positioning there. So clearly Turkey really isn't afraid of some sort of immediate action against Russia or Greece, at least at the moment. It is taking this opportunity to scare back some of the pirates and renegades around the African coast to potentially secure long-term resources in some of these areas, especially once the smoke and the dust settles from the Middle Eastern conflict. Somebody will need to be claiming all these key resources. Please note that of course, the Hejaz area, all these Arab states have remained very, very quiet recently. We don't see much being said from Saudi Arabia, and everything is quite silent on their end. I don't think those particular countries, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, really want to get involved in this particular exchange taking place between Iran and Israel in the near future, because they may be benefiting, Conrad, through rebuilding whatever damage is dealt. Right, just like
Yeah, Saudi Arabia, they said that they're not going to let any Iranian missiles fly over them, but they're really clarifying, like, we're protecting our people from potential fallout. We're not defending Israel. Like, we promise we're not defending Israel. It's like, dude, you're defending Israel. Come on. While the UAE also promises to lead the pro-Israel occupation of Gaza, give me a break. Not to interrupt, but it's very weak from the Arab states.
Yeah, look, somebody will need to initiate this new Lend-Lease type Marshall Plan, right, to rebuild the Middle East after it goes down. And I think the OG Arabs and these Yemeni Jews who run some of these dynasties and emirates over there in the Hejaz and around some of these key Islamic areas, I think they will be the ones coming to the forefront to assist in rebuilding the Middle East after everything is done, right? Given that I think, we do see Syria very much hoping that finally perhaps they will be able to take the Golan Heights and actually fulfill this rebuilding of Syria. And I think from the Golan Heights, of course, Syria can look forward to taking care of the Druze, the Kurd questions, not saying that they need to genocide them or anything, but, sort of resolving some of the ethnic tensions taking place along this Syrian landmass. Because again, Syria of this size, it hasn't been a country for very long, united. Of course, Assad's father has kept the country together, and Assad Jr. has had a lot of trouble with the globalists recently, of course, provoking a lot of these revolts and Islamic extremists and various minorities fighting for their independence. So Syria is not a very sort of cohesive, not in a very cohesive state at the moment, still in a way fighting for its survival. And in fact, we do know Assad is now on at least speaking terms both with Erdogan and both with the Arabic leaders and the King of Saudi Arabia. So in fact, maybe this will be that duality, that of assistance, but from the Turks and the Arabs in order to rebuild this former Hashemite kingdom, if there's anything left of the Levant after, whatever takes place does take place, right? And I think predictably we're all awaiting a massive strike on the Holy Land very, very soon from Iran, from Persia. And if they don't, frankly, my prediction is that they probably will. Even if it is controlled, I think Hezbollah has been calling for it. And I think moving forward, this is probably quite a dark prognosis, but we do need to be somewhat objective, Conrad, I think. Now, one other really important piece of news, given that we have spoken about Islamists and the problem with these various Islamic uprisings, both, in the UK, the sort of generation of Pakistani angst over the years and sort of Islamic crime, grooming gangs, things like that. It does tie itself into, of course, Bangladesh, that situation taking place there. Some very deep tensions. Some of the clips coming out are quite horrific. There's allegedly Muslims are hanging various Hindus off of bridges. There's a lot of really gnarly footage that you'd see from some sort of Mexican horror films. It's getting really bad, and I think over the next week we'll probably have a clearer understanding exactly what's taking place in Bangladesh. But it does appear that, one of the neighbor countries, Myanmar, a very similar situation. And how does this tie into Syria? Well, it's because, notice, this is how the globalists work in these sort of third world, moving on to second world countries, Conrad. And I mean, economically speaking, all these nations, naturally, they're scaling first, second, third world. It's all based on money, and of course, in a way, this monetary Satanism of measuring a worth of a nation by its wealth and gold. I mean, it's very Talmudic if you think about it, but we'll use this scale for now. And notice, Conrad, how the various so-called democratic movements, and these Maidans are essentially fostered and bred within these various countries from the inside. It happened in Syria. It's happening in Myanmar. Essentially, the junta, which is the current government in place, it's a semi-authoritarian sort of military dictatorship type government, which is trying to keep Myanmar at least cohesive. And there is this democratic resistance, which sporadically is appearing over the country. And China and Russia are supporting the junta, the sort of government in power in Myanmar, against this democratic uprising, which clearly has certain ties to NATO, the US, and probably like a lot of behind the scenes, most likely very deep ties to some of those globalist actors. Same thing happened in, of course, Syria. The same thing could be happening in Bangladesh in the near future. So we'll need to look out for that. And why I'm saying this is because at the moment, notice how the Maidan movement in Russia has been shut down for quite a while since the death of Alexei Navalny mysteriously in the northern colony of the Arctic Wolf, because of course the US, the globalists, are building up a resistance within Russia as well. Not directly within Russia, but outside in the sort of exodus provinces. So this recent 2024 prisoner exchange, the major prisoner exchange where Russia and Belarus released 16 detainees, while the US, Germany, Poland, various NATO countries released 10 detainees. So essentially it was a trade between various, allegedly spies, people who've committed treason, and this massive prisoner exchange, which it was massive not because of the numbers of prisoners, there's only 26 people exchanged both ways, but the level of media coverage. A lot of these people were extremely famous. So the Russians, they received the famous Vadim Krasikov, who is that, former FSB, essentially former FSB, the man who Putin called a patriot, who assassinated a Chechen terrorist in Berlin in 2019 before COVID in broad daylight. He was traded back to Russia. He was held in a Berlin prison. So he was traded. He's now on Russian soil again. The Russians actually gave up very key figures who will now be leading. They will be leading the Russian opposition in exile. And these are very key liberal figures with millions of subscribers on YouTube and some of these other Western platforms, such as, of course, Ilya Yashin, who used to be a friend of Navalny's. A very key figure, Vladimir Karamurza. He actually received 25 years of prison, and now he's been released. He's kind of a famous liberal, very strange-looking fellow, but his dad was a famous poet during the USSR, so he's not a completely random guy out of nowhere. His dad was sort of an elite type of cultural figure during the USSR days, and the son turned into this very liberal, anti-Russian, anti-Putin journalist. And the other figure was, of course, Andrei Pivovarov, again, a blogger who now Russia has released. So notice now, in exile, now that Navalny's dead, he was never traded, you do have this new building of a Russian liberal opposition. There will be new documentaries being made on YouTube. There will be people like Milov, Katz, of course, some of the former Navalny's wife, and the FBK, they'll be working together to combine this narrative of essentially what you can call anti-Putinism, and they'll be translating it on all the social media networks. So very risky trade for Russia to give up some of these, you can say, semi-charismatic personalities and giving them up to the West, because these people will be producing anti-Russian, you can even say anti-Orthodox content online now in mass. And in Russia, actually, they're speaking about potentially in the parliament shutting down YouTube on the Russian interwebs. So YouTube, either dramatically slowing it down or closing YouTube entirely. So YouTube may be banned in Russia, and you may only be able to access it over potentially VPNs, which a lot of Russians use anyway. So the democratic Maidan in Russia is at least forming now in the background abroad. And naturally, if we recall the Belarusian Maidan queen Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she has been her presidential term, which I believe commenced in 2020 when Lukashenko allegedly did not win the election. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, her term ended, but she was in exile amongst all the Belarusian liberals and Jews and people who've left the country. She was elected the unconditional, without a term, president of the Coordination Council of Belarus. So Tikhanovskaya, this lady who we spoke about in our A4 Hour episode focusing on Belarus and Lukashenko, definitely check it out. This lady of mysterious origins, potentially, most likely of Jewish heritage, right? We just have to point that out, particular town she came from. She is now the official Alexei Navalny type leader of Belarus in exile. And what's curious here, Conrad, is because Venezuela has the identical situation. There is officially a unelected Venezuelan president, Gonzalez, who everyone will forget about in about a year or two, because Maduro, well, according to the Venezuelan people, Maduro definitely won the election. There is some controversy there, but recall the previous Venezuelan election, Conrad. Allegedly, the entire European Union, Japan, Australia, the US, they stated that Guaido won the Venezuelan election in 2018, but we don't remember who Guaido is. These unelected, weird, liberal candidates simply disappear, they disperse, nobody speaks to them, they're not diplomatically valuable at all, and Maduro remains just as Lukashenko remains, and of course Putin remains in Russia, these alleged dictatorial figures remain in power. And I think what's interesting in the Venezuelan case is that, again, it ties together with the economic strife which South America is about to experience with the onset of the Third World War, given that so many people live, unfortunately, in such deep poverty. And we do have a lot of mixed coverage of what's happening in Venezuela, I think, from people like Jackson Hinkle, and some of these are very questionable figures who give a very biased socialistic perspective on the whole situation.
Maduro's blamed Zionist forces on the attempted coup, to overthrow him effectively. And again, I agree that there are nefarious forces behind this coup. We agree Juan Guaido was a clown. Obviously, this Machado girl character, as well as her Patsy Gonzalez, who supposedly won the election. I have no goodwill towards them either. I'm sure they'd be just as terrible. But now we see Maduro's regime going door to door, arresting people for, social media posts and all sorts of other things. So again, they're not going to be doing themselves any favors, but I don't necessarily see him getting overthrown anytime soon. Perhaps once he makes it through this, he might strengthen his resolve and try to unite the country around some kind of Essequibo campaign to reclaim the natural resources there, because we know that one of the most important things in South America is all of these natural resources with LNG, oil, and of course lithium, especially in Argentina, which is the entire reason why Milei was ever put into power to begin with. But Dimitri, earlier you drew a comparison between Myanmar and Syria, which is really important. Those are probably the two most analogous countries where these resistances can be directly compared. And of course, Russia is the largest direct supporter of the Tatmadaw junta in Myanmar, just as they are the largest supporter of Assad's regime in Syria. And the large city that was taken by the rebel forces in Myanmar was called Lashio. Again, I said, has over 130,000 people, and there have been shellings there and big fighting and hundreds dead for months now. So big battles are going on there. And of course, Myanmar, a lot less people filming things, a lot less internet access than even in Ukraine. So it's a bit more kind of out there with less Western coverage, but still very much a real front in the Third World War. But there's also an expanding front in Syria, as Syrian Arab Army local tribal forces have taken almost 90 square kilometers of territory. They are being called like the Mayadin Front, which is, I think, in the Deir ez-Zor region in Syria, which has historically been a major stronghold of the Western-backed rebel forces and ostensibly some parts ISIS as well. So it's good to finally see more and more pro-Assad forces slowly but surely taking back the last vestiges of holdout territory from the regime there. But yeah, you mentioned Jackson Hinkle. He was in Venezuela. He talked to Maduro. They went back and forth. Again, the fact that this guy's able to do all of this while people who do much less high profile stuff that are more right wing get harassed all the time by the feds and by the powers that be in the West. There's something going on there. There's just no doubt about it at this point. And be sure to listen to our most recent Ether Hour episode with Momchilo. We deconstruct the whole American Communist Party nonsense and all of the latest stupid escapades from Haas and Hinkle. So be sure to check that out. It'll be linked down below. But unless you have anything else to say about some of this South American situation, some of these other fronts in World War III, Dimitri, we should probably get into church news. And I've got some updates about Athos and Esfigmenou, but I want to hear you quickly brief the people on the situation in Estonia, because it appears that the government is trying to get them to schism from the Moscow Patriarchate, and of course the EP has their little nonsense mission going on in Estonia that they want to expand. So what's really going on there?
Yeah, it's a really bizarre situation. So in Estonia, unfortunately, the Estonian nationalists, who essentially are liberals, have been fostered and they've been raised essentially onto the USSR because, during the Russian imperial time, the Russians actually assimilated and integrated Estonians into Russian society a lot closer. So in fact, there was no real Estonian separatism, but Estonian separatism arose before World War II, during the Bolshevik Revolution, and even after that. And for some reason, the USSR, Khrushchev, Stalin, Brezhnev, etc., they always fostered this weird feeling of Estonian separatism and nationalism, which now has devolved into complete degeneracy, right? Estonia essentially is returning back to its pagan pre-Teutonic roots, which is really weird. But we are seeing, of course, the church being persecuted on a legalistic basis. The Estonian parliament, it seems, has pressured the church hard enough. And we have to keep in mind, why is that? It's because the majority of the real estate in Estonia, the cathedrals, churches, legally on paper, they belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But under a lease, which the EP has signed, I believe in the 90s, all this property has been moved, or it's on lease to the Russian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate, which they have been utilizing essentially. And there are literally no Greek Orthodox people of the Ecumenical Patriarchate living in Estonia. And suddenly now the government has said, look, if you don't disavow Patriarch Kirill and his particular statements and distance yourself from Moscow, we will begin cracking down on some of these properties and essentially destroying these parish and church communities. Can you imagine the damage that the Estonian government was about to do? So the Estonian Estonian bishops, and there's less than 5 bishops in Estonia, including Metropolitan Eugene, the head bishop, who's frankly not even in Estonia right now. He's next door, next to Novgorod, in the Pskov-Pechersk caves. And Metropolitan Eugene, I think he made the call with coordination with Patriarch Kirill, I think in secret, that the Estonian church will separate from the Moscow Patriarchate. And I think it's a temporary separation. It's not just my thoughts. A lot of Russian Orthodox priests who are quite patriotic and quite pro-Moscow Patriarchate, they have also come to this conclusion that it does seem the Estonian church will need to, for a time, during this World War III breakout situation when Estonia is a part of NATO, it literally has British, American troops stationed there. It is an occupied land, similar to how when the Third Reich captured a large part of Eastern Europe, the Russian church needed to send literal exarchs into the Third Reich in order to at least foster some of the church jurisdictions there, right? So it was a complex situation. Estonia is an occupied Russian land, which, was Russian from the time of Yaroslav the Wise, the saint, the son of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, who baptized Rus. So Estonia is, in fact, an ancient Russian land, which is at the moment occupied by NATO forces. And so the church in Estonia will now no longer commemorate Patriarch Kirill of Moscow at their liturgies. And also there's a question as to where they will receive their myrrh from, so that is the holy oil which is used during the chrismation of Orthodox Christians and during various anointing ceremonies. So those particular two factors, I think, are key here. So primarily, as long as Patriarch Kirill is not commemorated, then the Estonian church will no longer be harassed by the government. And I think this is a holding strategy, Conrad. It's a delay. Essentially, notice how it's almost like this can only be resolved through some sort of military reconquering of Estonia, which is very much what essentially Alexander Nevsky was partially doing during his War of the Teutonic Knights with the Battle of the Ice and stuff. So very curious historical analogies, a lot of films here, a lot of imagery comes to mind. But again, the Estonian church, it's not like they're going into a schism. I think this is a very coordinated, intentional action. And the only reason we haven't heard an official statement from the Russian church is because it needs to remain secret. You can't announce to the enemy of your plans, in order to delay the tactic of actually destroying the church, right? I mean, this is something that needs to be done in secret, and the church really cannot lie. So in fact, the only way around it is simply not to say anything. So in fact, this isn't the worst news in the world, but we do need to report on it. So the Estonian church, Metropolitan Eugene, they're very much still Orthodox, and they're still defending their right to this particular land and defending their parishioners and their spiritual children. I think that's their primary goals. And I'm sure people are still praying for the Patriarch and the unity of Russia in secret, alone in their homes, under this new state of NATO persecution.
I really agree with that analysis. And the people in Estonia, I think the church has done. It's very obvious that they want to maintain total unity. And I believe in his addressing of this, the authorities in Estonia, they literally said, we are not joining the ecumenical patriarch's mission that only dates back to 1996, when the Estonian Orthodox Church dates back to the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, with Saint Vladimir and the initial Russian missionaries that were evangelizing these lands and everything. So they're standing strong in their historical roots as Orthodox. But speaking of other issues, regarding schismatics and whatnot, we have a new report from Mount Athos. We reported last week that there was a likely storming of the Esfigmenu monastery by Greek police, and that the holy community, the sacred community, the council of the abbots had met to discuss this and to allow the Greek police onto the mountain, and that has been categorically denied. I'm going to read a statement from Athos here. This was published by Vima Orthodoxias. It says, the sacred community of Mount Athos has categorically denied recent reports that spoke of convening an extraordinary assembly and voting regarding the entry of police forces and heavy vehicles to carry out an eviction operation from areas of the Athonite state, specifically at the Esfigmenu monastery. The sacred community emphasized that there is much media misinformation regarding this issue. So that's good to hear. It appears that the Athonites are not just completely willing to basically sacrifice their autonomy and independence for the sake of, quelling this little schism that's going on. It's just 118 guys. I'm sure eventually it can be worked out without much more violence. We've already had Molotov cocktails thrown and all sorts of things. I don't think we need to be contributing to more violence and giving these schismatics more perceived martyrs, because that's only going to cement them in their schism. So I think this is good, and I think it's clear that the abbots understand that there doesn't need to be any more violence. So I hope that goes the right direction. I'm going to be on Mount Athos within the next 2-3 weeks, so hopefully there's nothing crazy going on. I'm also going to be going to Cyprus, so I hope that the Airspace is still open, as I mentioned before, but a recent video was translated with subtitles, a talk from Metropolitan Neophytos, who was sitting around with some pilgrims in his metropolis. He talks about the mission of each Orthodox country after the war. He talks about how there's going to be an ecumenical council that is going to solve the issues like the old calendar issue. It's going to solve the jurisdictional issues as well as a number of other contentious issues currently in the Orthodox Church. And then he begins talking about how each country will be assigned, another region of the world to evangelize to Orthodoxy. He talks about how the Romanians will have to evangelize the Latin-speaking world due to their Latin language. He's talking about Spain and Italy. He talks about how the Greeks will have to evangelize the Turks. And he's talking about how the Turks are learning that they actually have much Greek blood and are becoming proud of their Greek heritage. And then he talks about the Russians, how they will have to evangelize to the Chinese. And he talks about how there are many prophecies about Russia and China. I think he's probably mentioning St. Seraphim of Viritsa, as well as other prophecies about growing churches in China, which we're going to hopefully talk about more in the future. But it's a great video. We're going to have that linked down below. And hopefully I will be able to meet with and discuss all of these things with Metropolitan Neophytos very soon in Cyprus, so please keep me in your prayers regarding all of that. And it's very supportive if you subscribe to the show. It helps me travel and do all of these trips more easily because these plane tickets are not cheap. And as I mentioned before, I'm no longer gainfully employed elsewhere, so all of your support is greatly appreciated. But do you have any thoughts on Athos or perhaps the upcoming ecumenical council in the midst of the Third World War and the growth of Orthodoxy, Dimitri?
Yeah, of course. I think it's important to stay positive in our sort of view of the Middle East and, the Eastern Greek world, which, naturally in church issues has been full of bad news recently. But we do have these hierarchs such as Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu who give us hope. And some of these videos, like the video linked below, you mentioned the sort of 10 minutes of white pilling that he's providing us, talking about this future ecumenical council, which will resolve schisms. And we do need to note that him calling it an ecumenical council is very key because, again, ecumenical essentially is synonymous with imperial, and ecumenical councils historically can only be called by Orthodox sovereign emperors, autocrats of the Orthodox Christian Church, these sovereign laymen who are essentially the external bishops of the church. Somebody who, at the moment, there is nobody in that particular role. So whom exactly is Metropolitan Neophytos speaking of? Is he speaking about the Marble Emperor awakened, or perhaps the future Tsar, Orthodox Christian Emperor of Russia? It's just very hopeful that he is mentioning that there is this potential in a prophetic fashion of an emperor again returning, and Christ granting us this particular secular leader who could again lead us forward and potentially even assist the church by calling such a council and financing and funding one. Because a lot of these schisms, Conrad, as you know, they are formed because of a certain lack of conservatism or the rise of heresy amongst certain elements of the church. And there can be nothing more than securing, I suppose, even resolving the calendar issue and some of these long-winded issues with ecumenism, Sergianism, and some of these things which disconnect a lot of these zealous schismatics, including the ones at Esfigmenu Monastery and Manaphos, away from the true church, the Orthodox Church, which is active and conducting missionary work in the world and isn't participating in these schismatic activities. So bringing them all into the fold via an ecumenical council with an Orthodox emperor at the helm, I think this is something incredibly positive and something we get to look forward to, I think. And not just because of Metropolitan Neophytos is wise and you can almost say clairvoyant words, but because the prophecies of the saints have also confirmed this in their sayings over the last almost 200 years and definitely the 20th century. So I think these schisms don't worry me too much as some people, because again, they can be resolved quite easily as soon as certain events do transpire in the world and lukewarmness is lost, not just amongst the laity, but also amongst certain hierarchs in the church. So incredibly positive news, of course, from Metropolitan Neophytos. No positive thoughts about the so-called ecumenical council, which is not being called upon by an Orthodox emperor, frankly. I think it's cringe, and I think it's not traditional, right? There's nothing ecumenical, imperial about it, frankly, because, well, the empire needs to be reconstituted again, rejuvenated, hopefully in Russia, so that, again, it can have some sovereignty and independence. It would be very weird if St. John Vatatzes awoke and suddenly, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew informed him that in fact he has the imperial authority now, not you, St. John Vatatzes. So when we speak about the Marble Emperor, in our upcoming episode, Conrad, I think we'll need to discuss some of those interesting contingents, because it will be leading into this 2025 alleged ecumenical council, which should be frankly called a pan-Orthodox council, I think, by all means. But these people, they LARP all day, and it's probably going to be a deal with the papacy. I'm not, and it's good that you get to see Mount Athos, Conrad, before any sort of schisms or further action is taken, because we do know King Charles, right, the monastery that supports King Charles, and when he visits Mount Athos, he goes to a specific monastery on the Holy Mountain, wherein naturally they also support the Ukrainian schismatics. Several of the monasteries on Mount Athos, they welcome people like Metropolitan Epiphany and some of the false clergymen. They co-serve with them. It's very weird. Mount Athos is not in the best state, but there are still, and we do know there are not just elders living in the monasteries themselves, but also in the hills and the mountains. It's a place of much holiness, probably one of the holiest places on earth at the moment. So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and of course, all men at least once in their life, in their adulthood, should visit the Holy Mountain on a pilgrimage, which I think is very important here, that you're having this opportunity, and it just gives us all the reflection we need. And frankly, worrying about eschatology and the end of the world and World War III is not as important as worrying about your own personal end of the world, right? Your own death, and repenting before that. And I think this is probably what all listeners can reflect on, and probably are reflecting on, probably more than me, or, just so some of this news, of course, brings much despair to us. And, just discussing some of the persecutions in Ukraine, there are a few more little news stories I want to mention, Conrad, before we close off the episode, before we land the plane. Just a curious one. First and foremost, we had one of the false bishops, right? I mentioned these people who make these holy pilgrimages to Mount Athos, these weirdos, LARPing as bishops. Bishop Herman of Metropolitan Sergei Dyumenko's church, he actually on camera told Sergei Dyumenko, the false bishop of Kiev, that soon the cathedrals of Kamenetsk-Podolsk will be serving Ukrainian liturgies. So essentially, Kamenetsk-Podolsk has quite a lot of cathedrals which belong to Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev, the rightful bishop, and essentially this is a threat that there will be more takeovers very soon. So let's just expect that and pray for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Some more really weird footage came out. Again, this is relevant because in our 8-hour episodes, we always speak about the Svyatogorsk Lavra, located in the mountains of the Donetsk Oblast, near the river. Very beautiful site. It's in the background, the white stone monastery. Now, above that monastery on a hill in the distance, it's hidden by trees, fortunately, there's a large white statue of a Bolshevik named Artyom. Now, Artyom is the guy who Artyomovsk is named after, the new Russian name for Bakhmut, which frankly Russians should not be naming cities after Bolshevik demons. I think that's completely weird and strange. But Ukrainians have actually climbed up onto the statue of Artyom, which is standing, it's kind of like standing over the monastery, and they lifted up a Ukrainian flag onto this Bolshevik demon. So now there's a, Lenin created Ukraine, the Bolsheviks helped foster this particular creation, this abomination, and this homunculi. And now they're raising the Ukrainian flag on top of a Bolshevik statue, standing over the monastery, over which they now hold dominion, because they have captured the Metropolitan Arsenius, who was the headmaster of this monastery. Now he's in prison. So it's a complete, it all makes sense now, right? And of course, the Russian media in the stupidity have been promoting this idea of renaming Bakhmut, a name which is at least 200 years old, into Artyomovsk. So again, education is very, very important, not just from what we say, but also in the Russian news and media, because you cannot be naming cities after Bolsheviks. And just in the same vein of ancient monasteries and the ancient lavras of Ukraine, the third lavra, which we don't speak about very often, the Pachayev lavra, the Pachayevsk lavra, located in western Ukraine next to Lvov, so very far away. So when lighthearted people begin speaking, Conrad, lukewarm folks, they say, oh, well, Russia shouldn't take all of Ukraine. They shouldn't liberate all of Ukraine. They never consider the fact that the Pachayev lavra is very far west. And if Russia does not liberate it, the famous Pachayev lavra, which has so many miracle-working icons and relics, it'll be conquered by these schismatics, and they will desecrate it, just as they've desecrated the Kiev-Pechersk caves. What's interesting about the Pachayev lavra is on the 5th of August this year, they've celebrated their most famous Mary, the Mother of God, Theotokos icon, the icon of the Pachayev Theotokos. This icon it's very distinct. It looks like a regular medium-sized Theotokos icon, but it has a gold sun ray type framing around it. It's very cool looking. Now, there are videos on YouTube. I'm not going to recommend these to people, but back in my sort of curious, sinful days, I was searching up, Pachayev lavra is very famous for its exorcism services. And this icon, there is footage on YouTube where monks use this icon at the Pachayev Lavra when possessed Ukrainians, Russians, and various other people, Orthodox Christians who are under demonic influence, attend this monastery in Western Ukraine. And the icon, it literally, the possessed person would fall to the ground. They cannot even stand the sight of this icon, and demons would leave them. And it's like, I mean, you're not supposed to. My spiritual father later told me not to watch this sort of footage of exorcisms because it's not becoming of Christians, and there's probably some dark influence. Actually, demons play on your curiosity to see essentially some of these very mysterious things take place. But the Pachayev Lavra, notice, Conrad, these monasteries of the world, whether it be in the Holy Land, Ukraine, they are the places wherein demons are exorcised. Mount Athos as well, very famous. And these are the places where the globalists will be cracking down on eventually. This is their goal. Once they take the monasteries, just like the USSR, when they shut down every single monastery was closed in the USSR, all 900, 1,000 of them. Once the monasteries go, where do people go in order to exorcise their demons? Again, big questions, because these globalists, not only do they summon the demons, they also listen to them, they obey them, they, as per Alex Jones, they take drugs to sort of commune with them, right, in their sort of seances, and they work with them actively, as we see with people like Bezalel, Smotrich, Netanyahu. They obviously participate in this sort of these conglomerations with them, and in fact, the places of refuge for Orthodox Christians against these powers are monasteries, which is why the globalists, the Talmudic elements of the global elite, are actually aiming at monasteries specifically. And I think that's like probably the key message. So the 5th of August was quite awesome because the Pachayev Lavra, people filled the monastery, they were venerating this icon, and it was quite beautiful. Western Ukrainian Orthodoxy is very much alive. It's canonical, and it hasn't fallen to schism, and that's very key. So this monastery is still alive, functional, and I think it's giving hope to a lot of these Western Ukrainians. And I think that's a good kind of note for me to end on regarding persecution, because we do know a lot of bad stuff is happening, but at the same time there are these rays of hope sort of shining over the land.
Yeah, we're always going to be keeping the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in our prayers, and of course the abbots and the bishops that are being persecuted, as well as just the everyday lay people that are having their church calendar, their liturgical lives so disrupted. But with all of that, I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to ask everybody to please subscribe if you aren't already. worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. If you're already subscribed, please consider getting behind the paywall. You get access to almost 50 at this point ether-hour episodes, full deep analysis on all sorts of subjects, from Russian Orthodox history, prophecies, political analysis on the Holy Land, icons, interviews with priests, iconographers, abbots, all sorts of amazing stuff. So be sure to get behind the paywall and support the show and get access to all of that. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, WorldWarNow_. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. That's Gnome with a G. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's World War Now. We are trying to do more live streams on there. Also, be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That's one of the best places to keep up with the 24/7 news cycle that we are all so enmeshed in as World War III rages on. And we're on Rumble as well. And be sure to leave comments on all of these places. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, a bunch of other podcast places as well if you use the RSS feature on the website, worldwarnow.co, the Substack. So be sure to check all of those out. Share it with your friends. I want to thank everybody for listening to the very end and supporting us. I want to tell everybody I'll be praying for you. I'll be praying for everybody that's listening, the audience, as I go to Mount Athos, and I would appreciate all of your prayers as well. So thank you all so much for listening. And with all of that, God bless. We'll see you next time.